January 30th, 1649. Whitehall, London. A dense, cold fog sweeps through the city streets. Thousands of people are shoulder to shoulder, their breath visible in the winter air. The sound of murmuring voices and hushed whispers fades away as every gaze turns to a wooden scaffold towering over the assembled throng. A man in black stands on the platform, with a peaceful face, dressed straight. He's in a peaceful mood. His long wave of hair falls gently in the wind. He is not just any man. He is Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He will meet his fate in just a few moments. He does not resist. He does not beg. He walks decisively, as if surrendering to what's coming. Before him looms a masked executioner, his axe sharpened and polished, gleaming with cold morning light. A priest intones a last prayer. The silence is deafening. Never before has a reigning English king faced denunciation and death sentence from his own subjects. Kings had been toppled, exiled, even assassinated in the shadows. But never had one been tried, convicted, and publicly executed before his own country. This was the moment that would alter the course of history forever. Charles drops to his knees in front of the execution block. He took stock of his clothes and adjusted as necessary to also prevent a situation with his dignity. The executioner advances, hoisting the axe aloft. The audience stands, suspended in time. A lone drum beats in the square. The signal is given. The axe falls. How did it come to this? How did the King of England, once potent, untouchable, get so low? How is it possible for a man, born to royal state, bred to reign, be brought low before the people he rules? If we want to comprehend the rise and fall of King Charles I, we need to go back to the very beginning, to the birth of a boy who was never intended to be king, but who had the fate of a nation in his hands. Charles Stuart was born on November 19, 1600 at Dunfermline Palace, Scotland. He was the second son of King James VI of Scotland, who would later be King James I of England. Unlike his older brother, Prince Henry, Charles was never meant to be king. He was a quiet, delicate child who went largely unnoticed in the royal court. Charles had health issues from the day he was born. He had a speech impediment and found it hard to walk. While his older brother was prepared for the throne, Charles was put in the background, given little attention. In 1603, everything changed. Queen Elizabeth I England died childless. Charles's father, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England, and the two kingdoms were united. Now the Stuart dynasty had control over England, Scotland, and Ireland. Charles, only 3 years old, had been shifted with his family to England and found himself part of a rather larger, more powerful court. Life was different in England. Charles had a hard time keeping up with other royal children. He was timid, introverted, and pot-bellied. His father also had doubts about his capacity for leadership, preferring his firstborn son, Prince Henry, who was strong, clever, and popular. But fate had other plans. In 1612, Prince Henry became ill with typhoid fever. Within days, he was dead. The kingdom was in shock. And out of the blue, Charles, long ignored and neglected, was the heir to the English and Scottish crowns. Charles was now heir apparent to the throne, but he was unready. His father's creed was diplomacy, negotiation, and balancing the power of crown and parliament. Charles, on the other hand, was something else. He had been raised to believe kings ruled by divine right, that their authority came from God himself and was never to be challenged. Charles grew bolder as he grew older, and both cockier and more bull-headed. He regarded Parliament not as a necessary institution of governance, but as an impediment to royal power. This faith would shape his reign, and also bring about his undoing. Charles Stuart was crowned King of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1625 at the age of 24. His father had left him a tenuous kingdom, divided by religious and political factions. Now it was Charles's turn to reign. But challenges were soon to present themselves that would test the young king in ways he could never have imagined. Charles I was crowned King of England, Scotland, and Ireland on March 27, 1625. The young king ascended to a kingdom that was divided. Religion, money, and an uneasy relationship between monarchy and parliament. Right from the start, Charles was intent on ruling in his own manner. Unlike his father James I, who practiced diplomacy, Charles believed in absolute monarchy. He viewed himself as God's anointed ruler, above the laws and customs that bound him. He wanted Parliament to serve him, not contradict him. But Parliament had something different in mind. Charles's first moves in his new vocation will be to marry Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, in one of his earliest acts as king. This was controversial. England was a Protestant realm, and many worried that the new queen would impart Catholic influence on the royal court. These concerns were dismissed by Charles, but not by his people. His marriage exacerbated sectarian divisions and made him unpopular with Protestants. Charles very quickly got into conflict with Parliament. He wanted to increase taxes to pay for his military campaigns against Spain and France, but Parliament refused. They also insisted that the king not impose new taxes without their consent. Charles viewed it as an affront to his power. Charles's answer to this was to dissolve Parliament in 1625. He would repeat this several times during the early years of his reign, governing without them whenever they disagreed with his choices. This was the start of a dangerous dynamic. The king and Parliament engaged in a power struggle, neither prepared to compromise. By 1628, things had boiled over. Parliament wanted the king to respect the rights of his subjects, so it gave him the Petition of Right, a document demanding just that. It said he could not levy taxes without Parliament's permission, imprison people without cause, or deploy troops to enforce his rule. Charles signed it, but had no intention of honoring it. The climax came in 1629. Exasperated by Parliament's increasing defiance, Charles took a drastic step. He once again dissolved Parliament, but he took it a step further this time. He declared that he would govern by himself, without Parliament, for as long as he wished. This was the start of what would enter the history books as the personal rule, a decade in which Charles reigned as an absolute monarch, carrying out government without Parliament. He believed he had one, but in truth, he had put himself on a course to disaster. In 1629, Charles I took a brave and risky step. He closed Parliament and announced he would rule solo. For the next 11 years, England had no Parliament, no debates, no elections, no opposition. Charles reigned as he thought a king should, with unqualified power. But governing without Parliament meant governing without its purse strings. Charles needed cash, and with no one to authorize new taxes, he resorted to other means, some within the law, some extraordinarily unpopular. He called to revive old laws to compel wealthy landowners to pay loans to the crown. For failing to attend his court, he levied fines on nobles. But his most contentious act was imposing ship money, a tax, normally levied in wartime, used to finance the navy. This tax had previously only applied to coastal towns. Charles had spread it throughout the whole country. The people were furious. It was an abuse of power in the eyes of merchants, landowners, and common citizens alike. Some refused to pay. One such figure was John Hampden, a well-off Puritan who questioned the king's right to levy taxes without Parliament's permission. His case became a symbol of defiance. While Charles won the legal tussle, he lost something far more important, the public trust. Meanwhile, religious tensions were mounting. Charles and his advisor, Archbishop William Laud, pushed reforms in the Church of England that favored Catholic practices, ornate decorations in churches, elaborate rituals, and the enforcement of strict religious uniformity. Many Protestants, in particular, the Puritans, viewed this as a direct assault on their beliefs. But the actual crisis started in Scotland. In 1637, Charles tried to impose the English prayer book on Scottish churches. The Scots, who were fervently Presbyterian, viewed this as an attack on their religious freedom. Protests erupted. Riots broke out. A resistance movement arose among the Scottish nobility called the Covenanters. Before long, defiance of the prelate became outright revolt, the bishops' wars. Charles required an army to put down the rebellion. But raising an army, of course, costs money. And in order to get money, he had to invoke one possibility. He had to summon Parliament. In 1640, after 11 years without Parliament, Charles summoned Parliament again. But this was not the Parliament he had scorned years earlier. The members were bolder and angrier and intent on curtailing the king's power. They would not give him money unless he agreed to sweeping reforms, including ending illegal taxation, restricting the king's ability to dissolve parliament, and punishing his closest advisors. Charles, unwilling to give ground, dissolved them yet again after 3 weeks. This was called the Short Parliament. But he was not out of the woods. The Scots overran northern England, and Charles had to summon Parliament again. This time, he couldn't wave them off. This time, Parliament insisted on not leaving until their demands were met. This started the Long Parliament, and with it had begun the final confrontation between king and country. By 1640, King Charles I had painted himself into a corner. His military campaigns in Scotland had gutted his treasury, of his unpopular taxes had provoked anger among the people, and his decision to rule without Parliament had left him isolated. Now, having been forced to recall Parliament, he found himself confronting his biggest test yet. The Long Parliament, which was summoned in November 1640, was not like the parliaments Charles had sent home before. Its members were determined to disable the king's authority for good. They called for the execution of Charles's most loyal advisors, the abolition of illegal taxes, and restrictions on the king's ability to dissolve parliament. Charles really had no choice but to agree. He watched, powerless, as his closest allies collapsed one by one. His loyal advisor and General Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, was executed. Archbishop William Laud, who had imposed Charles's religious policies, was arrested. The king was losing control, but Charles was not ready to give up. He viewed Parliament's expanding power as a direct challenge to his authority. Things came to a head in 1641 when Parliament passed the Grand Remonstrance, a document of nearly every grievance against the king. It also proposed tighter constraints on his power, such as putting the military under the command of Parliament. This was too much for Charles. He viewed the document as an assault on his rule, a challenge to his divine right as monarch. The breaking point would come in January 1642, when Charles took a reckless step forward, one that would propel England to the brink of war. Marshaled by a handful of soldiers, Charles burst into the House of Commons, seeking to arrest 5 prominent members of Parliament. But the men had already fled. His bid for power, taken by force, had failed. Parliament was outraged. The people viewed it as evidence that Charles was a tyrant. London erupted in protests. The king, worried for his own safety, fled the capital. Now there was no going back. England was divided. Those who remained loyal to the king, known as royalists or cavaliers, marched to his side. Parliament agreed to prepare for war, and those who supported it were known as parliamentarians or roundheads. He raised his royal standard at Nottingham on August 22, 1642, signaling his war against Parliament. The English Civil War has begun. On the 22nd of August in the year 1642, King Charles I, standing on a hill in Nottingham, had his royal standard held up over his head. The flag fluttering was a signal to those who were loyal. England was now at war. But what Charles expected would be a quick victory quickly became a protracted and bloody war. The nation was rent in two. On one side were the royalists, or cavaliers, composed of nobles, landowners, and believers in the divine right of kings. On the other side were the parliamentarians, nicknamed Roundheads for their cropped hair. They were a mixture of Puritans, merchants, and people who just wanted government untainted by the king's influence. The first real battle came in October 1642, at Edgehill. Neither side declared victory, but the battle made clear that this war would not be decided quickly. The next 2 years were bloody ones across England, Scotland, and Ireland. At first, Charles and his royalist forces held firm. He depended on his veteran cavalry, which was commanded by his nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Cavaliers won significant battles such as at Lansdowne and Roundway Down in 1643, but risked a serious weakness, his money poor, Charles. He found it difficult to pay his own troops, and Parliament held London, the financial capital of England. Parliament won one key thing: Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a brilliant military commander who reformed the parliamentary forces into a highly disciplined and highly effective fighting force. He founded the new model army in 1645, a meritocracy based on skill rather than noble birth. It was well-trained, well-supplied, and tightly disciplined. Under Cromwell's direction, the tide of war turned. The turning point happened on June 14, 1645, at the Battle of Naseby. The new model army defeated the Royalists, taking thousands of men loyal to Charles prisoner and seizing his private correspondence. These letters showed that Charles had been negotiating with Catholic nations for military aid, damaging his own reputation further. His forces in tatters, Charles fled north, where he found sanctuary among the Scots. But in 1646, the Scots handed him over to Parliament. The war was over. The king was now a prisoner. But there was no end to the conflict here. A second war was on the horizon, one that would determine Charles's fate for all time. By 1646, King Charles I was no longer a sovereign, he was a prisoner. He surrendered himself to the Scottish army, expecting them to spare him after his amputation. But the Scots had interests of their own. For the price of £100,000, in 1647 they delivered Charles to Parliament. Such was the state of the kingdom, a cesspool of filth. The king, the most powerful man in the kingdom, now stood at the mercy of his enemies. But Charles was not going to give up. He schemed for his return to power, even in captivity. He conducted secret negotiations with rival factions, seeking to pit them against one another. He set Parliament against the Scots against the army against Parliament. His biggest mistake, though, was the believing he was irreplaceable. As Charles played for time, tensions between Parliament and the army began to boil over. Oliver Cromwell and his new model army thought that the war had been fought to rid the nation of tyranny, whereas many in Parliament still hoped to restore Charles on strict terms. The longer Charles waited to speak, the deeper those divisions grew. Charles hadn't given up any hope of escaping the pile he was in late in 1647. He fled captivity and fled to the Isle of Wight, where, in secret, he signed a covenant with the Scots. In return for his promise to establish Presbyterianism in England, the Scots had agreed to invade and return him to the throne. This resulted in the Second English Civil War, 1648. But Charles had erred in his calculations. The people had lost faith in him. Cromwell's forces put down the Royalist uprisings across England, and at the Battle of Preston in August 1648 defeated the Scottish forces. It was just months into the war, and Charles was once again a captive. But this time there would be no negotiating, no second chances. The patience of the Parliament and the army had ended. Charles was now regarded by many as a traitor. He had waged a second war against his own people, resulting in further slaughter. For Cromwell and his fellow leaders, it was an open and shut case. If England were to know peace, the king must die. Parliament was purged by the removal of those who remained in support of Charles in December 1648. The remaining members, who came to be called the Rump Parliament, announced that the king would be tried for treason. It was not a decision that had been made before. No English monarch had ever dared to be put on trial by his own people. Now the stage was set for the most shocking moment in English history, the trial and execution of King Charles I. On January 20th, 1649, King Charles I was tried before a court which had been assembled specifically for that purpose in Westminster Hall. The charge was treason, betrayal of the nation he once ruled. For the first time in English history, a reigning monarch was on trial at the hands of his own people. As Charles took his seat, the courtroom was silent. The judges who came before him were not nobles nor advisors. They were men of Parliament and the army, his enemies. The man who once declared that he spoke for God was now a defendant. The charges were read out loud. The king had made war with his own subjects. He had governed without Parliament. He had killed thousands. Charles had put his own power above the people, the argument went, and so had forfeited his right to rule. But Charles did not accept the court. He would neither plead guilty nor innocent. No earthly court had jurisdiction over a king, he claimed. He remained steadfast in his conviction in the divine right of kings. To him, this trial was a blasphemy, a defiance against God's appointed king. For days, the court heard evidence, letters, testimonies, and records showing that Charles had plotted to retake his throne by force. But Charles refused to defend himself. He did not respond, declining to whitewash the trial with his arguments. On January 27th, the verdict was in. Charles was convicted of high treason. The sentence, death. The decision reverberated in England. No monarch had ever been tried by his own government. Some clung to the hope of a last-minute pardon, a deal that would save him. But Oliver Cromwell and his supporters had made up their minds. Charles must be killed. 3 days later, the execution was scheduled. The preparations were made. A scaffold was erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The country prepared for an event that would make history. January 30th, 1649. Whitehall, London. The city is silent. In the biting morning wind, thousands gather, breath visible as they watch a scaffold being erected outside banqueting house. Today, for the first time in history, a king of England will be put to death by his own subjects. At 10 a.m., King Charles I is brought out of St. James's Palace. He wears 2 layers of thick clothing, not out of vanity, but so the cold does not turn him into a shivering mess. He doesn't want anyone mistaking his shaky for fear. He walks slow, purposeful. His face is quiet, serene. For Charles, it is not the end of his reign. He believes he dies a martyr, a king chosen by God and betrayed by his people. The scaffold is covered in black. In the center is a low wooden block. The executioner is standing there, face concealed by a mask. The crowd watches wordlessly, the dawning history Gothic. Charles advances and, still facing the executioner, "I am the King of England," he says. "I am the martyr of the people." He kneels down at the block, puts his head on it, and extends his hands, a sign that he's ready. For a moment, one moment, there is silence. The crowd holds its breath. The executioner tightens his hold on the axe. The signal is given. The blade glints in the cold light, one clean blow, and the king's head drops. A collective gasp ripples through the crowd. Then, silence. The executioner holds the severed head high for everyone to see. "Now let's see the head of a traitor," he declares. But the people do not cheer. There's no triumph of the air, only queasiness. A king is dead. What happens now? The death of Charles I is the end of the monarchy in England, at least for now. The country gets thrust into a new age, one without a king. But the question lingers, can a kingdom built on monarchy perfectly exist without one? The future of England is unknown, and soon the Game of Thrones will begin again. The execution of King Charles I reverberated throughout England and beyond. A monarchy that had reigned for centuries had been overthrown and its king executed by his own subjects. But with Charles gone, there was one more question. What now? England had no king for the first time in its history. The monarchy was abolished, the dissolution of the House of Lords. Instead, the country was founded as a republic, the Commonwealth of England. Power was now held by Parliament and the army, under the command of Oliver Cromwell. People thought that with this new government there would be freedom, stability. But peace did not come. Instead, England faced more unrest. The nation was painfully polarized. Royalists still desired to restore the monarchy, and radical agitators demanded even more profound political reform. In the meantime, Charles I's son, Prince Charles, would not accept his father's death. He made plans from exile in France to regain his throne. In 1651, he invaded England again, but his army was defeated at the Battle of Worcester. Charles, defeated, fled to Europe, where he stayed in hiding. Meanwhile in England, Oliver Cromwell rose to become the most powerful man in the country. By 1653, exasperated with their inefficiency, he dissolved Parliament by force and declared himself Lord Protector, a ruler in everything but name. It was no longer a monarchy, but it was no democracy either. Cromwell ruled with an iron fist, passing strict Puritan laws and brutally suppressing dissent. For the better part of the following decade, England was a republic, but the people became weary of Cromwell's severe rule. When he died in 1658, his son Richard failed to retain power. The republic fell apart in the absence of strong leadership. The army and parliament set against one another, and England reread chaos. By 1660, the people were fed up. They craved stability, tradition, yes, a king. Parliament invited Charles II, the son of the executed king, to come back from exile and take the throne. The monarchy was restored after years of war and division and failed republican government. Charles II rode into London on May 29, 1660, to cheering crowds. Reflected royalty. The Stuart dynasty had returned and kings would reign. But the execution of Charles I had irrevocably transformed England. No longer could a monarch reign unchecked. Parliamentary supremacy was secured and absolute monarchy was over. The destiny of Britain had been decided in the rise and fall of Charles I. His stubborn faith in divine rule brought him down, but his death made way for a government in which kings and queens would never again rule of their own accord. The monarchy was back, but the power dynamics had altered. England had emerged into a new era, an era that would shape the interplay between the crown and the people for centuries to come.